And a lot of people are skeptical that there is a real risk, but we have seen more and more of this happening. If we go back a few years in New Zealand in 2013, banks and financial institutions were captured by this new law, and that included lay people, companies who might be doing company secretarial or trust establishment, those kind of services. And when they were captured, it sort of clamped down, it put more of a net on them. So we did actually see people going to seek out lawyers and accountants and others who are not yet regulated. So we don't have good data on how many firms or that sort of thing, but there is probably a number of firms that have been misused in this way. You know, they may not have known about it. The penalties are pretty serious, as you would expect. We have to, I suppose, distinguish between actually being complicit in money laundering. Now, hopefully that doesn't happen, or it's a pretty rare case. There have been 1 or 2 incidents in the past of lawyers being convicted for that. But most of the time it will be a compliance or a regulatory failure, right, rather than actually helping and aiding and abetting money laundering. So even on that non-compliance side, the potential penalties for a firm could be, depending on how many offences and things they're charged with, can be quite significant. The most recent case, really the first case we saw in New Zealand, landed a small money remittance business with a penalty of $5.3 million. So that was quite a hefty, sizable fine imposed by the court, even on a small business there. I think it will be a long time before lawyers, get hit with that kind of penalty, hopefully. But I think the financial community and everybody's on notice that the courts will take these things seriously. In terms of the risk assessment, I'm definitely in favour of that being really done well and done thoroughly, and we spend quite a bit of time talking about that in the modules, the product that we put together with Thomson Reuters, because if lawyers spend the time and energy understanding where their risk areas lie, then they can make the whole compliance burden a bit easier. And often when you see a firm get into trouble, and in the past it's been banks and financial institutions, it often traces back to them not identifying a risk correctly, or if they write it up in a document, then not following through, not focusing on that risk as it changes. When it comes to doing the risk assessment, writing it up, it's a fairly substantial piece of work. And my view is law firms should be capable of doing it themselves. It's a piece of business reporting. It's like a due diligence report on their own firm and what the risks are. So I strongly encourage firms to start themselves, but refer to expertise where they need it. So that might be a consultant, it might be somebody like me, it might be the modules that we've written, but certainly get the expertise and the guidance, but don't just try and outsource it, because the firm needs to have some ownership of that business report, really. There's a whole range of records that need to be kept, both regarding risk assessment and other parts of the compliance program, and pretty much everything you do, there's a lot of audit trail, right? So keeping the paper trail, making sure that things are noted and documented. My view is lawyers should be good at that, right? The one thing they're good at is writing file notes and doing things, but it's important to keep that record both for the supervisor, the Department of Internal Affairs that will regulate this area, but also for the auditors when they come to check, because we've even had, the court recently say that if it hasn't been done, if you can't see the records to show that something's been done, then it's very hard to demonstrate you've met the compliance. So really vital. I think the record keeping has been understated, undervalued, and it is really important to keep a firm in good control of its compliance program, in good stead with the regulator as well. And so in terms of keeping a nice audit trail, it's helpful for lots of purposes, but most important if the DIA, the department, comes to talk to you and says, what happened about this client or this transaction you did or this instruction last year? If the documents aren't right, it's very hard to show them that compliance was done, that all the right due diligence was done on the client, the right information was kept. And so it's almost to protect your own backside and to demonstrate that you've done something right, you really need to keep the records. In terms of the additional requirements of this AML regime, it's probably quite a sea change for law firms compared to what they're used to. So the banking and financial community have had to get used to it, but it involves a whole lot of things. So obviously there's a need for a compliance officer, a specialist person who may or may not be full-time, but they need to really spend some time getting to know this area. And there's things like developing the risk assessment. There's other things like implementing transaction monitoring, keeping an eye on client activities, what they do, when will they generate red flags or alerts for risky areas. So all of that is a fairly specialist skill, and some law firms have been very good at doing due diligence to protect a client, but sometimes not turning that inwardly and doing it for themselves about the clients. So that's a little bit of a mindset shift as much as a new skill to acquire. I think for law firms, the enforcement side from the department will be quite strict, quite stringent. It will build up over time. So I predict they'll spend maybe the first year or so, there'll be a bit of a honeymoon period, nudging firms back into line, educating them, telling them what they're doing wrong. But as we've seen in the financial sector, at some point that honeymoon period ends, and it can end quite abruptly. So for firms that really haven't engaged and might be almost kind of disregarding the obligations, there's no guarantee that they'll be dealt with quietly. Otherwise, you can expect to see warnings and maybe some official publications and noting of problem reporting entities, problem businesses that are not doing enough. And then at some point that will turn into pressure to act, taken some enforcement action. But I don't think we're going to see that for a year or so, hopefully. For a lawyer, the problem is really quite acute if you do end up in enforcement action. Firstly, you've got a potential financial penalty and the threat of a court case and all these other things. But as much as anything, a law firm is built on its brand and its reputation these days. And so firms like that, the essence of what they do is trust, and they don't want to be seen anywhere near the whiff of money laundering or financial crime or a bribery matter or something like that. So I think it's that reputation and the personal trust issue that will be damaged if a firm gets caught up in this stuff. That's a good question in terms of, is what we're doing here, is all the compliance costs going to put a stop to money laundering? The reality is no, it's not. It's still going to carry on. But what it will at least do is mean that the legal profession is no longer seen as a kind of soft touch in this area, right? So it may just have the effect of sending the problem somewhere else, but it certainly clamps down on one area that the police, the Financial Intelligence Unit in the New Zealand Police, they've been concerned about for a while. The part where the rubber hits the road for most lawyers is if they ever get to a situation where they suspect the client of actual money laundering. And so there are quite heavy duty obligations in terms of reporting that to the police. In a way, the whole system is designed to lead to reporting of suspicious activity. So the lawyer must have a system that detects what is suspicious, and if they can't get good information, answers to their questions, can't research it and figure out that there is a rational perfectly good explanation for how the client got that money, why they're trying to do this transaction in this weird way, then they must make a call on reporting it to the police. And there's a process for that, and it's all secure and online. And it's quite a big decision, obviously, for a firm. So I advise people to treat it seriously, maybe canvass it amongst the partners in the firm, almost treat it like you would as if there was a major conflict of interest problem that the firm has to resolve. I think your question is a good one because the criminals are always moving, and drugs and gangs and organised crime, they have sufficient funds at their disposal. If they can't be bothered figuring out a way through the financial system, they'll pay somebody who is, right, an advisor or somebody who's in the financial system, sometimes even on the inside at a bank or something like that. So they're constantly looking for weak spots, and that can mean that lawyers and then accountants are caught up in it, and maybe they don't know, maybe they are being misused and not quite the smartest person in the room. When I got the opportunity to partner with Thomson Reuters on the AML workflows, as we're calling them, we really wanted to do a good guidebook, a handbook, if you like, for law firms, and particularly aimed at the compliance officer, the poor sod inside a firm who's now got this role, right? So the objective is to try and take them through a lot of information, but in a step-by-step, do-it-yourself way, because I am a believer that the firm should take control of this process, should write the material, and then they have to go, for instance, and train their staff and keep it lively, keep it as a living document. So it's a way of giving the firm, hopefully, the tools to internalise the knowledge and then run it themselves. There'll be certain points where there's jargon, there's expertise, and they'll want to refer to an outside person, maybe me, maybe a consultant, whatever. But the essence of it is, if we can write the manual in a sufficiently practical and non-textbook sort of way, then hopefully the compliance officer can use that material and figure out what they need to do step by step. I guess if I had one piece of advice for law firms, and this is sort of from 10 years working with financial institutions, they've had to deal with this problem. I think the one thing is don't underestimate the amount of time and effort this can take you. And so it is important to do it as a tailored, bespoke piece of work. So not just drag a template off a shelf, not just treat it as if you can borrow another firm's work. So make it your own, put in the time and effort to show that your firm is really taking the compliance seriously. And that will benefit you in the long run. It will mean the firm will stay on the edges of the radar of what the Department of Internal Affairs is looking for.